Welcome to Energypreneurs, the podcast where solar power batteries and electric vehicles come together. I'm your host, Sohail Hasni. When we combine these technologies, something powerful happens. On this show, I speak with founders, engineers, and investors who are building this fantastic new energy system. Thank you for joining. Thanks for joining. Just interviewed Karl Nolles, who is based in New South Wales. And he has been traveling all over the world. He lived in Thailand, lived in different part of the large cities all over the place, worked in Electricity Generating Authority of Thailand, managed the electricity market in Northern Territory. We discuss a lot of policy issues to bring in renewable energy and also what might happen in the future. And then his passion about the biodiversity challenge, especially with renewable energies and solar, large-scale solar, and how to address this. Good morning, Karl. I'm in Manila. Where are you today and what you have been doing? Tell us.
Good morning, Sal. It's a pleasure to be invited onto the show. I'm actually based today in sunny Orange, which is a city of about 40,000 people, 4 hours drive west of Sydney.
Wow. So you must have a very different perspective of the energy sector and everything, and living in a sort of rural areas of Australia, as opposed to, you mentioned earlier that you were living in some of the Asian mega cities. Tell us a bit more.
Okay, well, maybe I should step back to a bit of prehistory since you kindly, hand me the rope to do that. I actually have the dubious career distinction of being one of the first people to have lost a fair bit of their own money in carbon. I tried to set up a carbon fund back in about 1995, which is to say, bleedingly early. And we had this idea at the time that the fourth, then newly announced United Nations agreements and the Code of Protocol and such was leading to quite an upswell of interest around all these new carbon things. And we thought it would be an interesting idea to try and set up a carbon fund, which was going to do land-based carbon capture or carbon sequestration here in Australia. And I got together with some colleagues and we tried to set up this fund and we worked on it for 2 years. And then suddenly, out of nowhere, to our perspective, the Australian government, who had been saying, yes, we think ratifying the Code of Protocol is a great idea and we think international carbon trading is a great idea, they suddenly changed their mind and they said, no, actually, we've decided we're not going to ratify that. And the people we were dealing with at Deutsche Bank in London rang us up and said, look, this project that you've been working on for 2 years is completely worthless. You should all go away. And I took that as, a seminal learning about the dangers of regulatory risk on any of these sorts of things. So to come to your question about, the rural background and the perspective, I actually took that opportunity. It was a somewhat forced career change opportunity. In that case, I actually went off and became an academic, did my PhD on energy economics and looking at how electricity markets work and how in that, that particularly things like these then newly established renewable energy markets were working. I ended up as a director of the University of New South Wales Centre for Energy and Environmental Markets in my capacity as a full-time academic. I was writing lots of papers on that. And one evening, and this is actually genuinely how it happened, for those of your audience who are wondering how you get to do this kind of thing, one evening in 2007, I was giving a public lecture in my capacity as an academic at the centre, and it was going to be all about renewable energy markets and the finer points of electricity market design. And I said, look, before I start into all the academic stuff, I've got a case study about how to lose money in a hurry in this space. And let me tell you about it. And so I gave a plotted summary of all the things that went wrong on our carbon fund. And someone walked out the audience afterwards and said, I'm with Macquarie Bank. We're going to set up a new green finance business. Would you like to be an investment bank? And I said, well, that sounds fun. Let's do that. So, look, I've been very lucky in my career to have worked across the transformation of the energy sector, both as an academic and then as a banker and a business advisor. I've also worked in government. I worked in system control for the Northern Territory government on the management of the NT grid. So I've been very lucky to sort of work across this sector in multiple different roles as the areas evolved. So look, I wouldn't overemphasize the fact I now live in Orange, as giving us a particular perspective of renewables. It's a fascinating sector, but there's a lot of different things that you can go and work on.
Yes, and obviously, you also have seen the changes, right? When you're in the Northern Territory system control, it was all about coal, especially on the eastern part of Australia, right? And now suddenly everything is solar, right? And you earlier mentioned that you are also quite involved in the sort of solar and how it impacts the biodiversity. You want to highlight a bit on that as well?
Well, yeah, look, before we get into what I do now, which is the Biodiversity Credit Trading Fund, and obviously that's a matter that myself and my colleagues are quite passionate about. But yeah, look, you raised the point about the transformation of the grid. So look, it has been a fascinating journey over the last 30 or so years that I've been around the energy industry to watch it transform and watch the development of the electricity market. I was lucky enough to be working with the Australian Financial Markets Association when the national electricity market in Australia was first set up. We were heavily involved about all of these detailed questions about, well, how do you actually contract for electricity? What's the nature of forward markets and futures contracts on electricity? And all the setup and evolution and the setup of the what became EMO and the national electricity. There's a lot of fun stuff there. But look, to hone in on the time and system control, now this is an interesting one. So in Australia, of course, being a big place, we have a much misnamed Australian National Electricity Market, the NEM. In actual fact, it only really covers the eastern states and Tasmania. Western Australia has its own separate, completely separate electricity grid, and so does the Northern Territory. Okay, so the Northern Territory in Australia, which is equivalent in land space, land area terms to approximately the size of Germany, it's not small. It only, however, has 350,000 people in the entire Northern Territory of Australia. And yes, it has its own little electricity grid, which connects Katherine and the Northern Territory. Katherine and Darwin, Darwin being capital C. There is one transmission line that runs between those two cities. It is entirely, or it was when I was there, almost entirely supplied by natural gas, which is used in gas turbines to, supply the power for those two cities. There's then a number of other cities in the territory, like, for example, Alice Springs, which is a quite popular tourist destination. It has its own separate little isolated grid, right, which again also at that time was run almost entirely using diesel gensets, backers. Look, I was approached into a role of energy market in the Northern Territory because they had decided that they wanted to implement a solar target into the grid, and they had signed contracts for solar farms to be constructed around Darwin, and that they were going to put this power into the NT grid. It was only after these contracts were signed and people were building stuff that anyone actually said to the Power and Water Corporation, who are the operators of the grid there, well, how are we going to plug these power stations? And the answer was, well, you can't. Not only is there no capacity in the grid at that point, but there is no commercial framework. We are, Power and Water Corporation at that time was a vertically integrated government-owned monopoly that ran gas turbine generation and distributing to the consumers. There was no commercial framework for having third-party generation of any sort. And so the decision was taken to implement an electricity market to then allow for these solar farms to bid into the system, provide this generation. The problems that sit around trying to integrate large amounts of solar into a small isolated grid, this entire grid for the NT, for Darwin and Katherine, it's only got a maximum installed generation of around 150 megawatts, right? It's a small grid. And so trying to integrate into it all this stuff pushed all the boundaries around system stability and inertia and frequency control and all the sorts of issues that have been coming into focus in the NEM, which is a much, much bigger market, over time. We hit them all, early and upfront because we were a small isolated system trying to bring in, some large solar. It didn't all go smoothly by any accounts. In the case of Alice Springs, we had installed some new solar panels on a new solar farm and new batteries And we proudly switched all this on, and quite literally a cloud came over at the wrong time. And it turned out the batteries and such hadn't been set up, completely correctly. And Alice Springs got blacked out, including the hospital. We blacked it out for like 12 hours. And it was a huge scandal. There was a big government inquiry into it as to how this had happened. And what became rapidly clear was that whilst the technological promises that these things should work, in reality, they weren't fully tested. They weren't quite ready for what we were seeking to do with them. So there was some long and painful learnings.
Yeah, around what time was it? Which year?
Oh, that was around 2019.
Oh, 2019. I think we passed through, we did the GAN from sort of Uluru to Alice to Darwin. So I think we saw some of those solar, and this is sort of like a large microgrid at the time. So you still had those sort of teething problem with the batteries at the time, no? But now these are all sort of, we have giga batteries everywhere now.
Again, those battery installs are done in the NEM where you have a substantially large grid and large demand. And so you can sail through a lot of the questions around synthetic inertia that you can't when you're trying to do this on a microgrid. So for those of your audience that, suffer the career difficulty of not being electrical engineers, let me talk for a moment to synthetic inertia and real inertia. This is something that gets system control engineers very vexed, and yet isn't actually a common topic for the general policy. The inherent nature of something like a gas turbine is that with its spinning turbine, it will just ride through any minor perturbations that happen on the grid. If you're doing this if you're trying to achieve an equivalent inertia or ability to ride through some variations using inverters, you have to create what's called synthetic inertia, which is to say you have to be very rapidly monitoring exactly what the wave forms of that grid are. And then you have to be instructing the inverters to inject the power, that power off on a millisecond by millisecond kind of basis. Inherently, that is problematic. It requires processing power, a lot of things being all set up in just the right ways. I personally don't believe that all the questions around how to manage a large with distributed synthetic inertia have actually been fully solved. I think there are still very real issues there. And again, I'm not working professionally in the electricity industry anymore, but I do note reportage in the papers about how they are now looking at installing synchronous condensers, which are large rotating bits of equipment, to provide exactly that kind of support. So that would say to me that they also do not feel that those answers are fully there.
Yeah, I remember seeing in a pilot project in Flinders Island managed by Hydro Tasmania at the time, and they also had, this was early days, and when they put on the batteries, they actually had a literal flywheel behind one of the diesel gensets sort of to manage that, so genset could rev up and go, but the flywheel was taking the whole thing.
Yes, it was taking the shock.
Like literally physically sitting there to take on whatever comes through. And then they were also had some register to burn the extra to balance the system. Of course, that was a tiny system of few megawatt, maybe, yeah.
Yeah, but look, it's on the small systems where these problems are most obvious. And indeed, that was our experience in the NT grid too. We rapidly experienced these sorts of issues. So we were something of a canary in the coal mine for the broader them about what the difficulties there were.
A bigger game, one could argue, is happening behind the meter, right, as well, right? People with home batteries, electric vehicle, and potentially V2G coming in. So that changes sort of the dynamics a lot, because NEM sees net of that effect, of course, on a cloudy day or sort of a long period of cloud cover or something, right? So it's complicated.
It makes it vastly more complicated, but it also presents a lot of exciting opportunities. And I'm probably an example of that. I have my PhD in electrical engineering, so I know something about engineering and I dabble in software. one of the interesting things that, here at my own, the question came up, and solar, and I've got a plug-in hybrid electric car, and, in this particular house, we've got a couple of supply points because there's a flat in the house. And I actually looked at this and I thought, there's an interesting potential here. I can put one of the supplies onto a pool pass-through type contract, such as get with Amber Electricity, where you're getting 5-minute pricing coming through, all the time. And sure, most of the time that's much cheaper than the average tariff, but sometimes it's, $20 a megawatt hour. Yep. But, we could sign up for that. And I looked at that and I said, look, actually,
$20 a kilowatt hour. Almost.
Oh, yeah, sorry, kilowatt hour. Sorry, that's right, kilowatt hour. Yes, sorry, I'm thinking back there in my days. We worked in bigger numbers. No, kilowatt hour, exactly right. So obviously there's a couple of orders of magnitude in price change. So for me, personally, I said, well, look, that's actually interesting. I can write some software of my own that integrates onto the inverters, integrates onto the car, and I can wheel that power around, and I can, given that I've got one of these supplies on a fixed price tariff and the other one's on this variable tariff, well, when I need to, I can wheel the power from one side of the house to the other side of the house and, re-inject it. And, never used to be able to do that, in the past. So, look, the reforms have opened up a lot of potential for all sorts of innovation. But again, when you look at some of the hybrid, the actual detailed implementation, it has proved much harder than I think, many would hoped. In my case, when I bought my Mitsubishi plug-in hybrid electric, the Mitsubishi marketing material proudly touted that this had vehicle-to-grid capability. And of course, the moment that I looked at it as an engineer, I said, well, no, it doesn't. That's not really there. I know the marketing materials, as I said, but there wasn't. And of course, we're only still now seeing pilot scale rollouts of that sort of thing. All that and people like myself who are technical enthusiasts, perhaps, who are doing things. But look, it's a very dynamic space. Absolutely.
Yeah, I mean, I was not thinking as sophisticated as you're thinking, but we were in the sort of Australia Open and 45 degrees in Melbourne last week or the fortnight back. And I'm looking at, I have 13.5 kilowatt hour fully, the battery was fully charged. And I have a VPP arrangement. They said they will take, not Amber, another group, they're taking some out. And we were just balancing, okay, I don't want to charge the car now, stop, let the battery fill up because the temperature is still going up. And to be able to do that, this mini system control in your house is quite fascinating. But and then if collectively that is done and synchronized, that's unbelievable, right? Even a few years back.
Yeah, if you look at where we were a few years ago, we certainly weren't thinking that there was going to be that kind of level of sophistication there. But I think we have to also acknowledge that you and I may be somewhat more enthusiastic than many, electricity consumers are. And, I do actually pull the data about what's happening. I pull weather data from apps and I pull it into a machine learning model and do all sorts of, crunching. So I just do that because I have a background in the sector and I'm an enthusiast. But I'd expect that's how everyone is going to do this, right? Most people do not have the interest to do that.
No, I mean, they don't have interest because it's too tedious and complicated with the sort of technologies that are coming, especially with the robotics coming into people's home and AI taking over. So this definitely will be optimized because right now, a lot of homes have electric cars and batteries, especially with the federal government subsidy. And they're sitting on a suboptimal viewpoint from the societal perspective and also for the individual. But if you have a machine sort of looking after that interest, giving you the comfort buffer that you need, maybe those will come outside, right?
Yes, and I think that's right. I think that there is a very fortunate alignment with the development of machine learning models and AI in general, with the ability to deal with these complicated kind of optimization problems. I'm sure that will be the future, assuming, of course, that we get past the current issue of needing to build an enormous number of data centers everywhere and somehow powering all of them in the short term. I mean, I think that's the other big transformation that's rolled through. Certainly when I was working in system control, even just 5 years ago, none of our long-term demand forecasts had anything like the subsequent demand that is coming from all those data centers.
And electric vehicles, but also...
And electric vehicles, yeah.
But
the electric vehicles, We knew they were coming. We knew that when we had projections about them, but none of us were thinking about data centers. As I recall, I don't recall anyone speaking to me about a data center in 2019, 2020.
Now, from a system controls perspective, of course, one always worried about the low duration curves and matching supply and demand at the peak times. So what's your view on this, lack of a better word, experiment that federal government has proposed of free electricity for 3 hours? That is going to, or off-peak electricity with a zero tariff, right? Zero price.
Yeah, so look, again, as I mentioned earlier, I've sort of moved out of the industry.
No, I know. It's a views.
know,
There's a very
just,
well-informed policymaker customer, right?
Well, look, one can argue about how well-informed one is, I suppose. Yeah, look, I did hear that policy proposal, and it did strike me as something of a thought bubble that had been put up. I mean, look, in one sense, you'd say, well, look, it makes sense, doesn't it? If you've got certain capacity clearly on average, you've got certain capacity at certain times, then you'd be expected to see those prices as dropping. In a policy sense, it does strike me as something of a throwback to the old days where governments were stepping in and very explicitly setting the price of power to consumers. And there was a reason why we moved to creating an electricity market and getting government out of doing kind of tariff setting work. And the reason is because they did a very poor job of it. For those of us that remember or looked at these sorts of policy questions in the 80s and the 90s, the economic inefficiency of the government-owned, government-run power sector with its centralised tariff setting was legendary. They misinvested billions of dollars. Policy field was, I'm not comfortable with the idea of governments coming in and stating where they're going to be setting tariffs. I would prefer to see a framework that comes up where groups like Amber or others, not that I have any commercial connection to them, but just as one high-profile example, where commercial groups are able to say, well, actually, we can pass through the negative price events, low price events that you're seeing at those times. And consumers therefore can say, well, yeah, I can see that I do indeed have very cheap electricity for some periods. That strikes me as a market-compatible and system-compatible approach than simply mandating, certain periods of the day with things that are cheap. Because whilst that may be the case some of the time, it obviously won't be the case all of the time. So it is a broad brush answer to a complicated problem. So, yeah, look, I suspect we will not see the widespread rollout of 3 hours of free electricity every day, but many strange things have happened in the electricity industry over the years.
I mean, you mentioned earlier about regulatory risks, the privatized utility, especially in Victoria, where I was at the system control and the system planning at one stage. Of course, they took those risks, and the regulator's job, still the Essential Services Commission for distribution and others, they will make adjustment based on if government impose certain things. But at a broad principle, it's no different from a retailer saying, okay, I have all those negative prices, benefits I'm getting, and I also have exposure on the sort of evening time. Maybe this helps to move the demand shift. And then, of course, they are not a price maker. So government comes in as the bigger policy saying, okay, we do this and let's make adjustment and make sure, of course, the private entities are not worse off. That's what the regulatory frameworks are there for. One could argue that there is maybe a bigger public goods element if it works, because it's another market intervention like we used to have all of those peak-off-peak tariffs.
And look, and these sorts of market interventions are, I have never seen a market intervention that hasn't been accompanied by a chorus of people saying this is in the public greater good. That is always what people say when they're doing this. That needs to be set against the broader policy view around what's the effect of having a market where you are constantly seeing market intervention by government. Now, I am speaking, somewhat to my own history here. I actually did my PhD work on, the title of my PhD was The Uses and Abuses of Markets. So I actually went and looked at a whole heap of these. I looked at markets all around the world where governments had chosen to set up a market to answer some public policy. So, fisheries rights markets, and the Canadian market for maple syrup permits, and the renewable energy market and the electricity market and carbon markets, and all of the taxi plate markets. All of these things have a common underlying theme, which is to say that government has identified that there is some kind of public good problem, be it the cheap provision of electricity or the management of fisheries, and they then seek to harness the power of the market to drive efficient outcomes within that policy, that overarching policy objective that's been set. Now, what I concluded from having gone and researched these is that it presents a fundamental challenge to democratic governments when they're actually trying to do this stuff. What do I mean by that? Now, I should say here, I actually also worked as a parliamentary staffer at my group, so I've actually been in there watching this happen. The traditional way that policy gets made is that you as the government, pull into a room all the relevant kind of stakeholders, and you all have a big negotiation fight about how this thing might be done, and then some kind of compromise is reached that all the stakeholders can live with and the government can live with it, and then they lock it in. Well, good. If you then put a market around that, what happens is that the market has a logic of its own. It starts hearing off towards whatever the cheapest solutions might be, and they are not necessarily the ones that the stakeholders had thought of when they were originally doing this policy. So let me give a very specific example. Let's take the renewable energy market in Australia. Now, when it was initially set up, it was set up as a single, there was no large-scale certificate, small-scale certificate stuff. It was all one thing. Any sort of renewable energy could generate a renewable energy certificate, a REC, for having produced 1 megawatt hour of generation. And when that was originally put through, the overwhelming supply of renewable energy was from wind farm groups and groups that were already closely associated with the incumbent energy firms. What no one predicted was that there was going to be an absolutely explosive growth in rooftop solar. Well, once this system was set up, that's exactly what happened. And all of a sudden, all these other guys who said, hang on, that wasn't what we expected to happen. We thought this thing would be providing support for our big wind farm. We didn't think it was going to be supporting, all these solar, rooftop solar installations going in. And so the call went up, you need to reform the market. This market's not working. And that led them to then splitting the renewable energy scheme into a large scale scheme, big solar farms and big wind farms, and a small scale scheme for everybody else. That would work in a somewhat different way. It's a classic example where when the policy was set up, they didn't realise what was then going to happen when you let the free market loose on it. And as a result, the government then said, all right, well, we're going to have, since all our stakeholders are now screaming again, we're going to have to step in and do something. And they altered the rules. You see that process rolling out continually. And as someone who sat on the other side as an investor in this space, or working in banks that have been investors, it's very difficult. You then find yourself spending a lot of your time saying, well, what do I think is going to happen over the next 5 or 10 or 15 years? What's going to be the dynamic between the various different interest groups here, and who's actually going to end up being able to alter the rule in ways that benefit them? And it means that the decisions are becoming made by a read about regulatory policy process rather than on the basis of what you actually think the market economics would be telling you to do. I think I've seen plenty of examples of that roll out. All right, long answer to a short question there.
No, fair enough. So what's your view that the two policies now being rolled out? One, of course, electric vehicles are everywhere, and then this big subsidy for the home batteries. That will have a huge consequences. It looks like everybody's trying to get installing up to 50 kilowatt hour battery, no longer like a Tesla Power, 15 kilowatt hour. So people are going to the big ones. So what's your view? What might happen?
Well, again, I think it's, I observe here that I now regularly have people turning up to my doorstep wishing to, tell me all about the benefits of batteries and solar, and which is always an amusing conversation because they normally kick off by saying, do you know anything about solar? I suspect we will see, as we saw with the fringe benefit tax rebates on electric vehicles, a policy that when originally costed was thought to be going to cost in the order of $50 million, that has proven to be costing the federal budget billions of dollars. I expect that we will see that these are enthusiastically, the uptake, enthusiastic and probably exceeding the initial projections that the government agencies of the track history. Again, when you look back over the years at how good a job government agencies do of projecting what the future looks like and what the uptake of policy is going to be is not very good, right? They almost always get it wrong. That's not to say necessarily that private market participants always get it right, but the government track is certainly great. So, what would I expect to see there? I'd actually expect to see that, yes, those subsidies for batteries will be enthusiastically taken up. And as I said, the guys that used to install pig bats are probably now out here, installing batteries. This is the new high frontier.
What happens when everyone has installed? So what do you think, how will the world look like?
That is interesting, isn't it? So you do hear, of course, the optimistic view about, we'll be able to optimize all this stuff, use these machine learning models, we'll be able to have all these things nicely playing with each other, and the consumer will be able to harvest the return of the considerable capital investment that's made. And I think that will, in the medium term, probably be right. What happens in the shorter term, I think, will be a ongoing confusion around how exactly all these systems interrelate with each other and how the actual data flows occur in commercial arrangements.
But from that, what I was thinking, sort of per kilowatt hour per home is about 20 kilowatt hour, 25, maybe even less in other places. And if you are putting 10 kilowatt hour on an average now rooftop solar with 20, 30 kilowatt hour batteries, and your EV will consume maybe, I don't know, less than 5 or 6 kilowatt hour a day, unless people live in far out, right? So overall, there will be surplus energy at home level. Whether it's optimal, suboptimal issue is surplus energy, almost a free energy. And everyone has it. I mean, that changes the dynamics, societal dynamics in a very different way. Small businesses, small farms. Energy is a significant input, no? So as we are seeing through AI, that sort of knowledge is becoming almost a free, and then your energy becoming a free with autonomous vehicle and if your energy input is free, the transport is free. So do you have a view of the future world as to where we are going with all these marginal cost, zero marginal cost utilities that are coming our way? Yeah, resources, yeah.
Look, I would like to hope that kind of vision is one that we see emerge. And let me say, as a general theme thing, if you look back at the last 10,000 years of human history has been about the harnessing of energy. The per capita energy consumption has been an excellent proxy for every other type of human initiative over that time, right? And it has also largely been a story of humanity learning to use ever more energy dense forms of energy, up until quite recently, where we've had this push into renewables, which are less energy dense. Look, I don't think that you can see a move towards essentially the free energy surplus environment, partly also because one of the, again, core trends has been, as new technologies roll out, they tend to consume energy in new and interesting ways. So on the economy as a whole, the trend is towards a reduction in energy intensity per unit of GDP generated. GDP, energy to GDP generally decreases over time. But that said, some of the technologies that are rolling out now stand a very good chance of, altering that. And the AI stuff is a classic example of it. I mean, the sheer quantity of demand that is rolling in these data centers is extraordinary. It has caused if you look in the US, it is simply challenging the ability of any grid operator to successfully meet those demands. And this, of course, is why you see the announcements by groups like Microsoft buying and reopening the 3 Mile Island nuclear power specifically to provide power for the data center build that they do. So I think we're going to see, a period where those two trends run into each other. The trend that you mentioned of, well, once you've got all this low marginal cost renewables in the grid, then you'd expect to see marginal costs declining. To some extent, you do see that in daytime electricity prices, versus on the other side, the rapidly exploding demands for energy-intense activities in the economy. I suspect the energy-intense side of it is going to outweigh it over the next few years.
Seriously?
I suspect so.
Yeah, how much per capita demand a data center can produce? It's a cooling load at the end of the day, right? It's all about cooling load.
Look, I have not gone and recently looked at the stats on the level of projected data center load that is currently unable to secure supplies, but it is certainly measured in the hundreds of gigawatts worth.
I mean, in the global context, 100 of gigawatt is nothing, right? If you look at the whole world's consumption, because I don't think in any way the data center demand could exceed 10 or 20% of global air conditioning demand, put it this way.
Global air conditioning demand obviously is also subject to enormous growth as economic.
But it has flattened. I mean, like a Victorian system was always winter peak, it becomes summer peak, I think 1993 or 92. So, and now it looks like again becoming winter peak because the summer is taken over by solar.
Yeah, and in certain places and well-developed economies where you've already reached a closer saturation level on some of those things.
Yeah. So I don't think the data center will be way significantly more than the air conditioning load that we see, because it's hype, because it's concentrated in areas, because only few companies doing this big thing. Of course, for them it's big if you're trying to address the whole world, and the whole robots demand, those will be domestic. It's localized. Wherever you use the robots, because the electricity is not going to come if you have only the societies that will start adopting robot already will have a rooftop solar or some definition. Only those countries who have the money to have those rooftop solar and advanced systems. One could argue that most of those demand will be local. So I personally think that we are going towards that almost a free electricity world, because the cost of installing rooftop solar in any buildings is tiny compared to the cost of the sort of real estate that it's sitting on, unless it's, of course, goes into vast land masses and take over agricultural land, which I don't think is going to happen. There's enough land that are available, which is non-agricultural.
Well, look, again, these are matters about which, people can legitimately come up with different models. That's the thing about the future, isn't it? Predicting the future is always hard. So, look, I mean, I am less rosy than I think you are. I have to. And the impacts around these things, there are second-order impacts. So perhaps actually at that point I might, explore into where we're currently working, biodiversity funds. Now, we see here, to come back to the current business that myself and my colleagues are involved in, that is setting up a biodiversity credit fund that looks to invest into biodiversity conservation projects for the purpose of selling offsets from those projects for groups that are looking to do land clearing. Now, this is an interesting space because there, much as occurred with carbon back in the 90s, where you had a UN agreement that said you've set up global carbon trading, there is actually recently, like about 2 years ago, a UN agreement signed that is around the creation of global markets for biodiversity protection. At our count, there are now 40 plus countries around the world or jurisdictions around the world that have created biodiversity markets to attempt to deal with the impacts of land clearing. So we took a look at this space, and we note that in New South Wales, where I currently am, there is a government requirement, New South Wales state government, that if you are clearing land, you have to buy these land clearing offsets.
Mm-hmm.
That makes perfect sense. That market's been ticking along, doing a couple of $100 million a year of turnover. And we looked at that and we said, well, that's interesting. How about all these solar farms? Mm-hmm. And so we went and analysed all the plans for the 12.5 gigawatts worth of new solar builds that the New South Wales government has targeted to occur over the next 10 to 15 years in New South Wales. And we realise that there is a $500 million to $1 billion shortfall on the required biodiversity offset credits to meet the demand for all the land clearing that's involved for all those solar farms. It's actually the land clearing. What this means in practical terms, let's put it in context, the land clearing from solar farms in New South Wales in the next 10 years is considerably more than all the land clearing for property development. Considerably more. So, this is the sort of second order impact that, again, you don't tend to hear people discussing when they talk about the renewables rollout. These things do actually involve quite a lot of land clearing. That has to be managed. So yes, that's actually where we've been focused in on in the last years, rather in the market, the electricity market side of things. And it's one of those emerging areas that people generally haven't heard of, but I think it'll be much like carbon and renewables have been. You had carbon markets. I remember when I first worked in this space, no one had heard of carbon markets. This is much the same, right? No one currently, or very few people currently heard of biodiversity markets. That is rapidly changing.
So where is the offset here? If the organization is cleaning the land for for ground mount solar, how do they offset that?
So let's take the case of New South Wales, just because it happens to be one that we are currently working. Now, actually, let me start that somewhere else, right? Carbon markets were the correct assumption that 1 tonne of carbon dioxide removed from the air anywhere was the same as 1 tonne anywhere else. Yeah. It's an inherently fungible thing, and from a global warming perspective, that makes perfect sense. Biodiversity markets have to be different because protecting the yellow-crested cockatoo is not the same as protecting a snake. These things are intrinsically different. And so the result of that is that biodiversity markets tend to have much larger and much granular definitions of the sorts of credits that are there. So to take a simplistic example, in New South Wales, if you are clearing land, you are required by law to go onto the website and you mark the boundaries of the land that you are going to clear, and the government computers do some analysis on somewhat simple process here, but they do some analysis and it says, yes, that land is currently the home of 6 koalas and 5 endangered red gums. And before you are allowed to clear it, you need to find someone else, somewhere else, within the same biodiversity region, an area that is in many ways equivalent to the land that you are proposing to clear, and that also has red gums and yellow-crested cockatoos on it. And you need to do a deal with that landholder that says that they will put a fence around that land. They will enter into a perpetual agreement with government to never clear that land. And depending on what's currently on that land, let's imagine that land was currently farmland. They need to say, yes, we are going to replant that with native species and we're going to reintroduce stuff onto it. So they go through this quite complicated process of trying to match the things that are going to be cleared with the things that you're now going to bring back into conservation. It is, of course, inherently, at best, a zero-sum game here, where the way these schemes tend to work is to try to take the biodiversity impact to be neutral, not to necessarily make things better. It's just trying to not make things worse. But, again, let's put it in practical terms. If all the proposed solar farms that were going to go in the northern New England region of New South Wales, if all the stuff that was proposed in that renewable energy zone actually occurred, and if they said, okay, we are now going to need to go and buy bits of land that is also in New England, but it's got those right sorts of things on it, and we're going to protect that and conserve it, it would imply something like 30% of all property sales in the New England area for the next 5 years would be people buying farms and turning them into parks, right? It would be quite a transformational thing for the local environments in those states. So, we're expecting to see a lot of action and probably quite some controversy. in this.
So what will the biodiversity fund do in this particular case?
Oh, well, our fund, as opposed to the market more generally, one of the issues with creating projects under the existing biodiversity regulations is there's a lot of upfront costs to do it. So if you've got, let's say you've got a farm that's worth circa $5 million, and you say, look, I'd like to run that through this scheme and move it into conservation and generate some credits from it, the process for doing that could easily cost you $500,000. Probably take you a year to 2 years to actually successfully do it. And one of the issues that's arisen in these markets is that there's a lot of people who've actually got projects that they'd like to bring forward, but they do not have the upfront sheet to do. So we would invest into those projects with the assumption that we would later be able to sell the resulting credits.
Okay, so let me understand now. So someone is going to do solar in an area that has an impact, and they have to look for places to offset. Your fund is going to invest into projects, understanding what their needs might be in the future, and you're creating those projects to shorten the gap. And it has to be all sort of localized.
And yes, that's a very good summary of it. I mean, you can imagine that, a renewable energy project developer, they wish to be primarily focused on the question of developing their renewable energy project. They do not necessarily have balance sheet or skills to be preemptively starting developing the biodiversity offset project, which may well take 2 years to bring to market. And so, yes, we see an opportunity there for us to go and preemptively invest into this stuff so that when it's required, it's there.
Yeah, it's similar to like someone doing an energy efficiency project, saying this much avoided carbon dioxide, putting into market. Those who need to have a right to sort of emit buys those credit and needs offsets. But your one is way more complicated and case specific.
It has certainly raised, as we've gone through the process of setting this fund up, it has certainly thrown up a lot of legal and commercial complexities about how these things are actually really done. It's one thing to hand wave at it and say, oh, yes, we can do it. It's a different thing when you actually have nuts fit the bolts. I mean, just for example, the Australian tax code was not written with environmental credit instruments, be it water rights, carbon credits, biodiversity credits, or any of these sorts of things. These things were not even in people's minds when the tax code was written. Mm-hmm. And so you actually find, for example, that a fund that is investing into carbon credits or biodiversity credits actually gets a somewhat disadvantageous tax treatment compared to one that's investing into, say, houses. So, we've got a few things over the years that the government is going to need to look at as we go through. But look, it's been a fascinating process as we've gone through it, setting the fund up.
Thank you so much for your time. Is there anything else?
Well, it's been, a pleasure to be on. You promised me that we would have a fascinating chat and that, I've had a chance to talk about all my enthusiasms.
That's it.
So, look, it's been a pleasure.
Thank you so much for your time. I really appreciate it.
Thank you very much.
So what's the best way to connect with you if somebody get really excited at biodiversity? I know a couple of people who might be. So tell me.
Oh, well, being excited about biodiversity is the correct response, may I say. We're all certainly excited about it. Look, the simplest way to reach out to us is to simply do a Google on Skander, SKJANDER, Skander, or biodiversity, or Google my name, and biodiversity, and I'm sure we will pop up under all those circumstances. We do obviously have a LinkedIn profile, and I invite anyone who's interested to reach out, connect to me on LinkedIn. Follow Skander on our Skander LinkedIn page, where we continually post about developments in this space. So, happy to talk to any of the viewers who have any interest.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you for listening to Energypreneurs. Let's work together electrifying everything. This podcast is available in audio form on your favorite platforms and in video on YouTube. See you on next episode. Please feel free to subscribe to our channel, and we always appreciate your comments.